Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves was actually a pretty disappointing movie. Now before going into this movie, I actually heard a lot of positive things about it, mainly that it was actually pretty fun and funny throughout, and that led me to believe that this was the type of movie that would know exactly what it wanted to be and make fun of the fact that it was based off D&D. And after seeing the movie, I can't really say that I got that out of the experience. Now for starters, I will say that there are a few jokes throughout this movie that I found to be genuinely funny, mainly the graveyard scene, and the reason why that scene worked in particular is because it took ideas and concepts from the game and made fun of them. I do remember there were at least 2 other times throughout this movie where I remember laughing at certain jokes, but I really have to say that the vast attempts at humor were just so lame and unfunny. And I think the biggest problem that this movie has is that it just takes itself way too seriously. There are so many scenes and ideas throughout this movie that are just trying to constantly get you to sympathize and care about these characters, but it's just so forced and lame and entirely uninvesting. I will say that there were a few action sequences throughout this movie that were actually pretty fun, but again, another issue is that they were very infrequent throughout the entire movie. In all honesty, this movie doesn't even feel like it's based off D&D just based on how generic fantasy it is. It honestly feels like you could switch the title to almost anything else and it wouldn't really affect the outcome of the film at all. The soundtrack for this movie was incredibly formulaic and predictable, and it was so uninteresting to listen to. So overall, just kind of a waste of a half-decent concept, really. Had this movie and concept been passed on to a different writer, it probably would have turned out very differently from what we got. But right now it feels like a movie that just had a lot of potential that felt unfulfilled. And so this one gets a 5 out of 10. Now another movie that I want to talk about in this video would be Thunder Road, written, directed, and starring Jim Cummings. Now one thing to really note about this film, this movie functions more as a character drama type movie, and what that means is basically the story kind of is loosely structured around this main character. But I personally find that worked very well for this film because I found this main character to be incredibly watchable. The main character in this movie is incredibly interesting, flawed, and likable, and Jim Cummings does a really great job portraying this character. There are several scenes throughout this movie where you can truly show a range of emotions, and it feels like this character was written with a lot of care. Speaking of which, every actor in this movie did a very good job with their performance. Everyone felt like they fit their character very well, and they're all likable and have a great dynamic with each other. And the child actor in this movie was not terrible and was actually managed to be quite convincing at points. Now this movie was only made with a budget of $200,000, but despite having such a low budget, that didn't stop this movie from being ambitious in its own right. A lot of scenes within this movie take place in one choreographed long take. These takes often have a lot of motion involved with them and a lot of aspects to keep track of, and this method of filming the movie made it feel so much more professional and higher budget than it actually was. Everything in the movie from a visual standpoint is very well done and filmed in a very interesting way. And not to mention that this movie can be incredibly emotional at times, and especially near the end of the film. Now overall, this movie was incredibly well made and a great indie feature. It was funny, dramatic, emotional, and I highly recommend it to people. So this one gets a very strong 7 out of 10. Now another movie that I saw that I want to talk about in this review would be Near Dark. Now for those of you who are unaware of this movie, this is a grounded, realistic take on what a vampire's life would actually be like. Suffice it to say, this movie is pretty bleak and gritty, and the movie does a really great job establishing this. The movie has a really nice blue color palette at nighttime shots. It makes it feel like it has its own memorable look and style to the movie. The makeup and costume design for the main group of characters does a really great job of showing them being drifters and rough and tumbled. The overall look to this movie does a really great job of communicating its bleak, gritty tone. Now I was really interested in the ideas that it presented of being a real-life vampire, such as having to lay low during the day in a cheap motel, having to block out your windows to your van before you go out during the day so you don't get burned, and having to skip town every now and then so people don't find out about you. Overall, it's pretty bleak and depressing. Now this movie is only 96 minutes long and does a really great job with its pacing. It never feels slow or like it's wasting time, and it's always keeping you engaged with something going on. The main cast of vampires have a pretty fun, watchable dynamic with each other. There's some very well written dialogue that shows their clever banter with each other, and it establishes their kind of relationship that they have. Now, a criticism that I have of this movie is that some of the actors' performances are inconsistent. The 2 main leads have some pretty high and low points during their performances, and some actors definitely stand above others. Lance Hendrickson did a great job with his character performance, and I felt he was the best actor in the movie. Bill Paxton was a fun addition to this movie, and he felt like he fit his character rather well. The lady from Aliens did a very good job with her performance as well, but the little girl in this movie was very unconvincing throughout, and I never believed her performance. Now, another issue that I have with this movie is how it was structured going into the third act of the film. In all honesty, it seems like it kind of rushed from the second act into the third act almost immediately, And what actually happens in the third act of this movie is something that I'm very unsure about how to feel about. I don't want to spoil it, but it feels like it kind of goes into a different direction from what this movie is. And the third act is not terrible, it just feels like it has so much potential to be better. Maybe I'll feel differently about that when I watch this movie again eventually, but for right now I think that's a pretty fair way to sum up how I feel about it. Now overall, despite some flaws, I really enjoyed this movie and I definitely recommend it to people, so this one gets a good 6 out of 10. Oh yeah, I also saw Inside Out 2. I don't really have that much to say about this movie and I didn't feel like making its own video for it, so I'm just gonna throw it in on this video. Now, I actually enjoyed the first Inside Out movie. I really connected with its themes and ideas throughout the movie. It was a very formulaic, by-the-numbers type movie, but that doesn't make it bad inherently. But the ideas and themes of the movie are really what keeps you thinking about it. It's a fun little movie and I gave it a 6 out of 10. Now, this one feels like a kind of watered-down version of the first one, and what I mean by that is that it feels like it suffers from sequelitis. Basically, just take the script from the original movie, change a few things, put a little different spin on it, and call it its own thing. And the similarities between this movie and the first one are pretty noticeable. Now, the biggest issue with this movie is that it failed to really impress me on any of its themes and ideas that it presented throughout the film. It just feels like it doesn't really have that much of a resonating emotional power as it did the first one. It's a pretty formulaic, by-the-numbers movie that I found it difficult to be invested in. And in all honesty, it felt like this movie could have just been longer and it could have explored more ideas and themes. Now, I don't hate this movie, I just don't really have that much to say about it. I gave this movie a 6 out of 10 when I walked out of the theater, but in all honesty, I think it just deserves a 5, and I don't really see any point to me rewatching it again. So, there you go, 5 out of 10.